An arrogant karate master humiliated Steven Seagal in front of his entire dojo, believing his fame was nothing but a myth. He dared to punch him in the face, challenging his composure, but in seconds realized the biggest mistake of his life. What followed wasn't a fight, but a lesson in humility, self-control, and the true meaning of inner strength. The crowd roared inside the Tokyo Martial Arts Expo. A sea of flashing lights, screaming fans, and cameras pointed from every angle, all waiting for one thing: the clash between two legends. In the center of the enormous arena hung banners with the names of the world's greatest masters, each representing a different discipline: judo, aikido, muay thai, karate. And at the top of that list, written in elegant Japanese calligraphy, was the man they had all come to see: Master Kenji Tanaka, 6th degree black belt, the reigning world karate champion. He was thin, with sharp eyes and a body honed by years of discipline, but what truly set him apart was his arrogance. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed he had conquered the world. For years, his explosive knockouts and brutal style had made him a global sensation. But what really landed him in the headlines wasn't his victories, but his attitude. He proclaimed himself the last real fighter, and that day he planned to prove it once again. Only this time his target wasn't a young contender or another champion, but Steven Seagal. When Seagal entered the arena, the crowd's reaction was different. Some applauded, others whispered, and a few chuckled as if they couldn't believe their eyes. He wasn't wearing a traditional ring, gloves, or carrying the air of a professional competitor. He wore only his unmistakable black attire and that serene expression that seemed out of place amidst that roar of energy. Tanaka smirked at him. "You're a legend in the movies," he said, giving a mocking, fake bow. "But this is real life. No scripts, no cameras cutting before you go down." Seagal nodded once. "Real life doesn't need cameras to show the truth." The crowd reacted with a collective "oh." Tanaka chuckled. "Then let's show the truth, old man." The referee raised his hand. A bow of respect, but Tanaka didn't wait. The instant Seagal's head tilted forward in respect, Tanaka exploded into motion, grabbing his shoulder and driving his knee straight into Seagal's face. The impact crackled like thunder. Seagal stumbled back half a step. The crowd erupted in screams and chaos. Cameras flashed like lightning. Tanaka leaned back, raising his arms in triumph, shouting to the crowd, "There's your movie star. That's Hollywood for you." The crowd was yelling at Cow demanding the count. But Seagal didn't go down. He stayed on his feet, his head rose slowly. He brought a hand to his face, wiping away the trickle of blood that ran down his lip. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. Tanaka's smile vanished. Confidence began to crack on his face. Then Seagal spoke in a low, firm, and dangerous voice. "You made 2 mistakes." Tanaka frowned. "What mistakes?" Seagal took a step forward. "First, you struck before you could even bend down." "And the second?" Tanaka asked. Seagal's eyes narrowed, cold as steel. "You forgot who you were striking." Before anyone could process it, Seagal moved. There were no showy stances or visible preparation, just a sudden movement, terrifying in its precision. He entered Tanaka's space like a shadow through smoke. One hand deflected a blow before it even finished, and the other delivered a short, brutal punch straight into the Japanese man's sternum. The sound was deep, like a hammer striking a drum. Tanaka gasped, the air escaping his lungs instantly, but Seagal didn't stop. The next blow was low, crushing Tanaka's ribs. The next, an inverted fist that crashed with terrifying precision into his jaw. Each strike was small, controlled, compact, yet each carried the weight of years, discipline, and unshakable calm. Tanaka staggered backward, his face contorted with shock. What is this?" Seagal grabbed his wrist, twisted it with a fluid motion, and elegantly redirected his balance. The champion crashed to the floor with a thud, the echo reverberating throughout the arena. The same crowd that had cheered Tanaka seconds before was now utterly silent. The air was icy, heavy, as if everyone were holding their breath. Seagal stood over him, his eyes sharp but calm. "Respect," he said softly. "It's not about bowing, it's about knowing when not to strike." Tanaka groaned, clutching his ribs as he tried to rise. "You think you can humiliate me in my own country?" Seagal tilted his head slightly. "You humiliated yourself." Tanaka roared, fueled by rage, and stood up. Reason was replaced by pure fury. He charged again with his famous spinning kick, slicing through the air with deadly precision. But Seagal was no longer there. He darted through the space like a ghost, intercepting the leg mid-turn, stepping inward and driving his elbow into his opponent's thigh. The sharp crack echoed throughout the stadium. Tanaka screamed, falling again, clutching his leg in despair. The crowd watched in chilling silence. Seagal looked down at him, breathing calmly as if nothing had happened. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a whisper echoing through the arena. "You came here to prove you were strong," he said. "But all you've proven is that pride weakens even the best." Tanaka snarled through his teeth. His pride was even more wounded than his body. "Fight me like a man." Seagal shook his head. "I am, it doesn't look like it," Tanaka growled. Seagal replied calmly, "Only you don't recognize it." And without warning, the fight was over. A single, perfect, clean punch, no noise, no pre-punch, just a straight fist charged with absolute precision. The impact was so clean that Tanaka fell to the canvas instantly. The echo of the blow hung in the air long after his body hit the canvas. The crowd gasped in unison, paralyzed with disbelief. Seagal stepped back, relaxing his hands at his sides. He didn't celebrate, didn't shout, didn't look at the cameras. He simply bowed to the fallen man and turned to leave. The referee didn't count. There was no need. Tanaka lay motionless, groaning. The stadium remained silent, broken only by the click of camera flashes capturing the moment. Reporters rushed toward the ring. The commentators stammered, unsure what to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," one said, his voice trembling, "Steven Seagal has just destroyed the reigning world champion." The crowd erupted again, not in celebration, but in astonishment. They had witnessed something real, something beyond spectacle or competition. A man who didn't fight to win, but to teach. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're listening from. We appreciate your support. The men in the dojo began to laugh. One of them shouted, "Go on, Sensei, show him what real karate is." The atmosphere was thick with mockery and tension. Steven remained motionless, observing the supposed master with an almost disconcerting serenity. His gaze conveyed not fear, but a dangerous calm. The Japanese master began to circle him, trying to provoke him. "What's wrong, foreigner? Don't you know how to greet your master?" he said sarcastically, extending a leg with martial precision. But Steven didn't respond, only bowed his head slightly as if recognizing a spirit he had seen before, that of arrogance disguised as discipline. The master felt humiliated by the silence. He took a step forward, stamping his foot to intimidate. "Come on, move!" he shouted. But Steven barely breathed. And then, without warning, the master attacked. His knee rose in a swift, precise strike, a strike that in the world of martial arts could end a fight before it even began. The knee slammed into Steven's face. A murmur rippled through the room. The students froze. The sharp crack of the impact echoed like a sentence. The master took a step back, convinced he had finished the lesson, but when he looked down, his pride shattered in an instant. Steven hadn't fallen. He didn't even move, just watched with the same serene expression as if nothing had happened. A thin trickle of blood ran down his lip, but his posture remained firm, unwavering. The dojo fell into absolute silence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "That was it?" Steven said in a deep, measured voice. The master took a step back in surprise. "Impossible," one of the students whispered. And in that instant, everything changed. Steven moved not quickly, but with such controlled precision that it seemed time had slowed down. His right hand blocked the master's arm. His left hand grabbed his wrist, and in a single twist, the Japanese man's body flew to the ground with a thud. The tatami trembled. Steven didn't need to shout. He didn't show anger. His gaze said it all. True strength needs no noise. The master lay sprawled, coughing, stunned by the speed and control of this man. He tried to get up, but a pressure on his wrist made him groan. Steven crouched down and whispered, "Never use your art to humiliate. Ego is the first enemy a warrior must defeat." The master looked at him, his pride shattered, respect growing where mockery had once reigned. The students who had laughed were now silent. None dared to move. Steven stood up, walked to the door, and before leaving said without looking back, "The dojo isn't a ring, it's a temple, and you turned it into a circus." As he crossed the threshold, the wind that swept in from outside fluttered the dojo's banners. Silence hung in the air, as if time had stopped to remind everyone of what they had just witnessed. A lesson no fight could teach. The master, still on the ground, clenched his fists and murmured. He was no ordinary man. One of the students, still trembling, replied, They say he was a Marine and left the military because he saw too much. The master looked at him incredulously. A Marine? The young man nodded. Yes, they say his name is Steven Seagal, and that he never fights out of pride, only when justice calls. The teacher lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of his own words, his arrogance, and the public humiliation. Outside, Steven walked in the rain without looking back. His silhouette faded into the dawn mist. He sought neither glory nor revenge, only peace. But fate never leaves in peace those men born to fight for others. The rain fell heavily that night. The district's neon lights barely managed to pierce the downpour. Steven walked silently through the wet streets, his black jacket soaked, his gaze fixed ahead. He wasn't thinking about the fight, he wasn't thinking about the blow. He was thinking about the same thing that always tormented him, the violence he swore to leave behind. But in the alleys of the world, peace never lasts long. Behind him, an engine started. Then another. 2 black motorcycles followed him with their lights off, and before Steven could turn, a third man appeared from the side, blocking his path. They were 3 of the dojo's students, the same ones who had mocked him hours earlier, only now they weren't laughing. The teacher wants you to learn not to humiliate him, one said, his voice trembling but full of rage. I'm not looking for a fight, Steven replied without raising his voice. You already found one, the other spat, brandishing a metal chain. The first blow came quickly. A clumsy, desperate attempt. Steven dodged it effortlessly, twisting his body just a few inches. The chain sliced through the air, and before the attacker could regain his balance, Steven grabbed his arm and threw him against the windshield of a nearby car. The second man tried to strike him from behind, but Steven blocked his leg, pushed him against the wall, and with a single movement snatched the weapon away. The sound of metal hitting the ground echoed amidst the thunder. The third man hesitated, his gaze lowered, trembling. We get paid to do it, Steven murmured. He approached slowly, his face impassive but his voice laden with truth. And if you were paid to destroy your soul, would you do it too? The young man swallowed, unable to answer. Steven looked at him with compassion and he let him go. Silence filled the street once more. The rain continued to fall, and in the reflection of the puddles, Steven saw his own weary face. Not the warrior's, but the face of a man who had seen too much darkness and still tried to salvage some light. He turned and continued walking, unaware that a figure was watching him from a nearby rooftop. It was the dojo master. His eyes reflected a mixture of wounded pride and a thirst for revenge. That man made me look like a coward, he muttered. And no one humiliates Satoru Tanaka in his own temple. Beside him, an older man in a dark suit spoke calmly. I warned you, Tanaka. He's no ordinary fighter. He was from the Shadow at Special Forces. They trained him to disarm 10 men without using a weapon. I don't care who he was, Tanaka growled. He made my honor bleed, and that can only be washed away by his defeat. The old man smiled ironically. Then be prepared to lose more than just your honor. Tanaka didn't answer. He just clenched his fist and climbed down from the roof, determined to call for a public rematch. Meanwhile, Steven took refuge in a small roadside diner, a lonely spot on the outskirts of town. The place smelled of hot soup and old wood. He sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and closed his eyes. The waitress, a kind-looking woman, watched him curiously. You don't seem to be from around here, she said as she poured the coffee. I'm not from anywhere anymore, he replied in a grave voice. That sounds sad, doesn't it? It sounds free. For the first time in days, Steven smiled, but the calm was short-lived. In the distance, the sound of several engines began to fill the air. The reflection of lights filtered through the restaurant window. The waitress looked worried. She was expecting someone. Steven placed his coffee on the counter and stood up. No, but they were waiting for me. 5 men got off their motorcycles, dressed in black jackets and gloves. They were the students from the dojo, and behind them, walking with a determined stride, was Satoru Tanaka, the arrogant master who had sworn revenge. The restaurant door burst open. The wind carried rain and tension. Tanaka spoke first. This time no one will stand in our way, just you and me, face to face with no witnesses. Steven looked at him without hatred. The problem with you, Tanaka, is that you confuse respect with fear, and you confuse humility with weakness, the Japanese man retorted, assuming a fighting stance. The air grew thick. The spoons on the counter rattled. The waitress backed away in terror as the 2 men sized each other up with their eyes. The duel hadn't begun, but fate had already chosen its stage. Outside, the storm raged like a war chorus. Inside, two men were about to clash, not for power, but for the very soul of martial arts. The silence inside the restaurant was almost sacred. The rain lashed against the windows as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Steven and Tanaka stood a few feet away, two men shaped by war, yet with entirely different souls. The waitress, trembling, whispered, "Please go outside." "Don't destroy this place." Steven lowered his gaze and nodded. "She's right. This place smells of life. It doesn't deserve the weight of our violence." He went out first, calmly opening the door. The icy wind stung his face. Tanaka followed without a word, leaving behind the murmur of the other men. Outside, the storm raged relentlessly. The restaurant lights flickered, casting flashes that seemed from another era. They stood face to face in the rain in the middle of the empty parking lot. Water streamed down their faces as if the world were trying to wash away their sins. Tanaka tightened his belt and assumed his stance. "This time I won't hold back." "You never did," Steven replied firmly. "Only now you'll know what it means to use art without purpose." The first attack came with lightning precision. Tanaka spun, unleashing a roundhouse kick that whistled through the air. Steven blocked it with his forearm, the impact resounding like thunder. Both moved with the grace of seasoned predators. Neither screamed, neither spoke. Only the sound of the water and the crunch of the ground beneath their boots set the rhythm. Tanaka attempted a direct blow to the face, but Steven dodged it with a mere tilt of his head. Then he countered with a shoulder lock, twisting the Japanese man's arm and sending him crashing to the ground with almost unreal fluidity. Tanaka fell backward, gasping for breath, but he didn't give up. He rolled over. He stood up and with a roar unleashed all the fury he had accumulated. Punches, kicks, movements of brutal speed. Each technique was a masterpiece, but empty. Steven blocked one after another without anger, without haste, until finally he stopped a fist in midair. His hand enveloped the master's, firm as steel. "This isn't karate," he said in a low voice. "It's desperation." With a precise movement, he deflected the energy of the blow, spun around and immobilized him, pinning Tanaka's arm against his back. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, soaking them both, but Steven didn't loosen his grip. Tanaka screamed in pain. "Finish me," he roared. "Do it, coward." Steven leaned close to his ear without changing his tone. "I didn't come to destroy you, I came to save what's left of you." And he released him. Tanaka fell to his knees, exhausted, drenched, defeated by something more powerful than any technique: compassion. Steven took a step back without looking back. His voice was lost in the rain. A true master teaches with calm, not with anger. The students watched from the restaurant doorway, silent, their eyes wide with astonishment. They saw their sensei defeated, but they also saw something more: respect reborn in silence. Tanaka, still on his knees, looked up at Steven, who was already walking away. "Why didn't you finish me?"
he asked between gasps.
He paused for a second, gazing at the horizon, because the greatest punishment is living with the knowledge of your wrongdoing. Then he continued walking. Thunder rumbled above them. The rain lashed against the pavement as if the world were applauding the end of an ancient battle. The students rushed toward their teacher, but Tanaka stopped them with a wave of his hand. "Don't follow him. That man isn't my enemy. He's my mirror." His words hung in the air as the restaurant returned to its quiet. In the distance, Steven climbed onto an old motorcycle and started the engine. Rain fell on his face, but he barely smiled. "Another lesson learned," he murmured. As he rode away, an inner voice echoed in his mind, that of his former army captain. "The art isn't fighting, son. It's understanding when it's no longer necessary." The road stretched out before him, illuminated only by flashes of lightning. His figure faded into the darkness, leaving behind another chapter in the story of a man who sought not revenge, but redemption. But something far away, something else, was already beginning to stir. Once upon a time, an enemy he wouldn't forget, a past that wouldn't rest, and on the horizon a new war awaited him. 3 days after that night in the rain, the world seemed to have stopped. Tanaka's dojo remained closed. The students scattered, and the story of the foreigner who humiliated the master spread throughout the city like an unquenchable fire. Steven, for his part, had disappeared. He took refuge in a cabin at the edge of a forest where only the wind and the crickets were his companions. His hands, calloused by the years, held a cup of tea. The steam rose slowly, as if he wanted to caress the memories he avoided confronting. But the peace once again didn't last long. The roar of an engine broke the silence. A black SUV pulled up in front of the cabin. Two men in dark suits got out. They weren't in military uniform, but their posture said it all. They were from the government. Steven sighed and placed his cup on the table. "You took longer than I thought," he said without turning around. One of them spoke in a firm voice. "Captain Seagal, we need your help." Steven closed his eyes. "I'm not a captain anymore. I left that world behind. No, this time it's an international operation. Someone is moving chemical weapons across the Pacific, and his name has appeared on the list again. My name." The leader of the network was one of his own, a Marine, Colonel Mason Reddick. The silence grew heavy. That name was an open wound. Steven stood slowly, turning to face them. His eyes showed something between fury and pain. Reddick should have died 10 years ago. "He didn't," the agent replied. "And now he trains mercenaries using the same tactics you taught him." Steven clenched his fists, didn't reply, just stared out the window at the storm brewing again on the horizon. "If I return, it won't be for you," he finally said. "It will be for the innocent men he'll turn into weapons." The agents exchanged a glance. "So you accept the mission?" Steven barely nodded. "Tell your general I don't need orders, just a direction." The men left. The rain began to fall again. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Okina, Satoru Tanaka trained alone. His body still ached, but his mind had changed. He remembered every word Steven had told him. Ego is the first enemy a warrior must defeat. For the first time he understood. As he meditated, a monk approached. "Sensei, there's a man asking for you. He says he's from America." Tanaka's eyes widened. "A man, what's his name?" "He says his name is Steven Seagal." The master stood up, his hands trembling slightly. As he left the temple, he saw him there. The same serene face, the same presence impossible to ignore. "You came," Tanaka murmured. "I need your help," Steven said. "There's a common enemy, one that knows our techniques but not our soul." Tanaka nodded slowly. "Then let's fight together, not for pride but for balance." They looked at each other with respect. They were no longer rivals, but two parallel paths that had finally crossed. Hours later, the two men were traveling on a military plane toward the Pacific. The mission, to intercept a mercenary ship carrying chemical weapons to Asia. On board, Steven reviewed maps and coordinates. Tanaka watched him silently, admiring the discipline that emanated from every movement. "Tell me something, Steven," the Japanese man finally said. "Why do you fight?" Steven thought for a moment. "Because I still believe there are things worth protecting, even if the world no longer sees them." Tanaka barely smiled. Perhaps art still held hope. The plane began its descent through the clouds. The storm raged below as if fate awaited them with open arms. Meanwhile, on the ocean, Colonel Reddick's ship advanced. Inside, armed men patrolled the corridors. Reddick himself, his face scarred and his gaze vacant, watched the radar. "So Steven Seagal's back in the game," he whispered with a crooked smile. "Perfect. This time I'll bury him myself." In the distance, through the darkness and rain, two shadows descended from the sky by parachute. One was the Japanese master who had learned humility. The other, the American warrior who sought only redemption, and together they were about to ignite a war the world would never forget. The gym was silent. The arrogant karate master, the same one who moments before had tried to humiliate Steven Seagal, lay on the floor, panting, his eyes unfocused. His pride had been shattered faster than his guard. Steven, barely breathing, stood calmly. There was no hatred in his eyes, only disappointment. "It wasn't my intention to destroy you," he said quietly. But arrogance always ends up breaking men before the fight does. The crowd, which just moments before had been cheering the Grandmaster, now remained in reverent silence. The students of the dojo lowered their heads, understanding that they had witnessed a lesson that went far beyond martial arts. The master, his voice trembling, barely murmured, "Who are you?" Steven bent down, helped him to his feet, and answered in a grave voice. "Just a man who learned that true strength isn't shown by striking, but by knowing when not to." The entire dojo froze. It was as if those words had pierced the skin of everyone present and reached straight to their souls. Steven walked toward the door, leaving behind the echo of the master's shame and the weight of the lesson he had just imparted. But just as he was about to leave, a voice stopped him. "Sensei," shouted one of the fallen master's young students. "Could you teach us?" Steven stopped. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. He had spent too much time running from dojos, from names, from fame. But that instant, that purity in the boy's eyes changed him. "I didn't come to teach punches," he said without turning around. "I came to remind you that respect is earned, not with fear but with honor." And with that, he left. The arrogant master sat on the floor, his eyes moist. He had lost the fight, but he had gained something greater: humility. He stood up, bowed deeply toward the door through which Steven had left, and quietly said, "Thank you, master." 2 weeks later, rumors about the foreigner who had humiliated the sensei had spread throughout Tokyo. Some said he was a former soldier, others that he was a former agent who had sworn never to fight again. But no one knew the whole truth. What they did know was that Nakamura's dojo had changed. No longer were there shouts of arrogance or humiliation, only discipline, respect, and silence. In a corner of the tatami, a small plaque read, "Strength without control is weakness in disguise. Steven Seagal." Miles away, in a small Buddhist temple hidden among mountains, Steven trained alone at dawn. Slow movements, deep breathing, absolute silence. An elderly monk approached him calmly. "Why do you continue training if you no longer have any rivals?" Steven asked. He opened his eyes, looked toward the horizon, and replied, "Because my rival is myself, and that fight never ends." The sun rose slowly, illuminating his silhouette. The wind stirred his black robes, and for an instant, his figure resembled that of an immortal warrior who had transcended violence. As the karate master recalled his defeat and his students learned the true meaning of honor, Steven Seagal vanished once more into the mountains, leaving behind only a legend, a story whispered in hushed tones. With respect and a touch of awe, the man no one could defeat because he had already conquered his own ego. Extended epic finale. Film version. Months later, an international martial arts tournament brought together the world's finest masters. And among the crowd, someone walked silently, unremarkable, without fanfare, with a confident stride. The announcer introduced, "And now, a special Aikido demonstration by our surprise guest." When Steven Seagal stepped onto the mat, everyone held their breath. His presence commanded respect effortlessly. With a subtle gesture, he invited 3 fighters to attack him simultaneously. In less than 10 seconds, all 3 were on the ground without a single violent blow, only fluidity, control, and unwavering calm. The audience erupted in applause, and as they chanted his name, he simply bowed, murmuring to himself, "True victory is the silence that remains after the war." The camera slowly pulled back as the wind stirred the dust from the tatami, and the music swelled, solemn and heroic. Thus ended the story of the man who was humiliated, attacked, beaten, and who taught the world that the greatest revenge is inner peace. An elderly monk approached him calmly. "Why do you continue training if you no longer have any rivals?" Steven asked. He opened his eyes, gazed at the horizon, and replied, "Because my rival is myself, and that fight never ends." The sun slowly rose, illuminating his silhouette. The wind stirred his black robes, and for a moment, his figure resembled that of an immortal warrior who had transcended violence. As the karate master recalled his defeat and his students learned the true meaning of honor, Steven Seagal vanished once more into the mountains, leaving behind only a legend, a story whispered in hushed tones. With respect and a touch of awe, the man whom no one could defeat because he had already conquered his own ego. Extended epic ending. Theatrical version. Months later, an international martial arts tournament brought together the world's greatest masters. And among the crowd, someone walked silently, unmarked, without fanfare, with a firm step. The announcer introduced a special Aikido demonstration by a surprise guest. When Steven Seagal stepped onto the mat, everyone held their breath. His presence commanded respect effortlessly. With a subtle gesture, he invited 3 fighters to attack him simultaneously. In less than 10 seconds, all 3 were on the ground without a single violent blow, only fluidity, control, and unwavering calm. The audience erupted in applause, and as they chanted his name, he simply bowed, murmuring to himself, "True victory is the silence that remains after the war." The camera slowly pulled back as the wind stirred the dust from the mat, and the music swelled, solemn and heroic. Thus ended the story of the man who was humiliated, attacked and beaten, and who taught the world that the greatest revenge is inner peace. An elderly monk approached him calmly. "Why do you continue training if you no longer have any rivals?" Steven asked. He opened his eyes, gazed at the horizon, and replied, "Because my rival is myself, and that fight never ends." The sun slowly rose, illuminating his silhouette. The wind stirred his black robes, and for a moment, his figure resembled that of an immortal warrior who had transcended violence. As the karate master recalled his defeat, and his students learned the true meaning of honor, Steven Seagal vanished once more into the mountains, leaving behind only a legend, a story whispered in hushed tones, with respect and a touch of awe. The man whom no one could defeat because he had already conquered his own ego. Extended epic ending. Theatrical version. Months later, an international martial arts tournament brought together the world's greatest masters. And among the crowd, someone walked silently, unmarked, without fanfare, with a firm step. The announcer introduced a special Aikido demonstration by a surprise guest. When Steven Seagal stepped onto the mat, everyone held their breath. His presence commanded respect effortlessly. With a subtle gesture, he invited 3 fighters to attack him simultaneously. In less than 10 seconds, all 3 were on the ground without a single violent blow. Only fluidity, control, and unwavering calm. The audience erupted in applause, and as they chanted his name, he simply bowed, murmuring to himself, "True victory is the silence that remains after the war." The camera slowly pulled back as the wind stirred the dust from the mat, and the music swelled, solemn and heroic. Thus ended the story of the man who was humiliated, attacked, and beaten, and who taught the world that the greatest revenge is inner peace. Everyone held their breath. His presence commanded respect effortlessly. With a slight gesture, he invited 3 fighters to attack him simultaneously. In less than 10 seconds, all 3 were on the ground without a single violent blow. Only fluidity, control, and unwavering calm. The crowd erupted in applause, and as they chanted his name, he simply bowed, murmuring to himself, "True victory is the silence that remains after the war." The camera slowly pulled back as the wind stirred the dust from the tatami, and the music swelled, solemn and heroic. Thus ended the story of the man who was humiliated, attacked, beaten, and who taught the world that the greatest revenge is inner peace. Everyone held their breath. His presence commanded respect effortlessly. With a slight gesture, he invited 3 fighters to attack him simultaneously. In less than 10 seconds, all 3 were on the ground without a single violent blow. Only fluidity, control, and unwavering calm. The crowd erupted in applause, and as they chanted his name, he simply bowed, murmuring to himself, "True victory is the silence that remains after the war." The camera slowly pulled back as the wind stirred the dust from the tatami, and the music swelled, solemn and heroic. Thus ended the story of the man who was humiliated, attacked, beaten, and who taught the world that the greatest revenge is inner peace.